COVID is a factor that's going to be in there, but we're very excited to get started. Well, I'm pleased. My name is Brian Tormey, and very excited to welcome everyone to our webinar. I'm going to turn it over to Richard, CEO of HGAR and president of One Key MLS, to do introductions and get us started.
Brian, thank you so much, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here, and Happy New Year. Welcome to Be Your Best, our webinar series to share best practices for getting real estate deals done in New York. As Brian said, I'm Richard Haggerty, CEO of the Hudson Gateway Association of Realtors. We're a not-for-profit trade association representing more than 13,000 real estate professionals in Manhattan, the Bronx, Westchester, Putnam, Rockland, and Orange counties. I'm also president and chief strategic growth officer of One Key MLS, the comprehensive multiple listing service for the New York region. One Key has more than 44,000 subscribers and serves the region from Montauk to Manhattan to Monticello. We've all navigated through another year of unprecedented events. And as you've just heard, we're grappling with a pandemic that shows no signs of retreat. But New York is nothing but resilient. And today we're going to talk about the market's rebound, what it means for buyers, sellers, and how to get deals done in 2022. We're very pleased to partner with TitleVest and have President Brian Tormey moderate our discussion yet again. TitleVest is a leading New York City-based title insurance company and member of the First American family of companies, offering a full range of services for real estate property purchase and refinance transactions. TitleVest has offices in Manhattan and Westchester and engages in transactions upstate, downstate, and nationwide. TitleVest has won the New York Law Journal's Best Title Agency Award every year since 2013. That is quite the streak, Brian. Now let's meet our panel. We're pleased to have with us Marissa Tracy, Director and Global Private Banker at Citi Private Bank. Also joining us is Jonathan Miller, President and CEO of Miller Samuel Inc., a real estate appraisers and consultants. And finally, we have Joe Rand, Chief Creative Officer of Howard Hanna Rand Realty. Joe is also the Executive Director of the Broker Public Portal, a collaborative venture between real estate brokerages and multiple listing services that connects home searchers directly with the agent. Marissa, Jonathan, Joe, thank you so much for joining us for what's going to be a great panel discussion. And now I'll turn it back over to Brian.
Thank you, Richard. And thank you as well to Jeff, Gary, Kathleen, and the whole HGAR team for creating this series and hosting it for the last, we're almost up to 2 years now. I bumped into someone recently and they were like, and they didn't really know around town. They didn't really know what I did professionally. They're like, wait, I've seen you on this thing. Those things are so helpful. Thanks for doing them. So just some little feedback. I think it is having a good impact in the market. With that, I want to do a couple quick housekeeping items. To everyone in attendance, we greatly encourage questions. We've got a fabulous panel today of some real industry experts, and we encourage questions. Our suggestion and request is to use the Q&A function, which for most of you will be at the bottom of your screen. It's two little chat bubbles over each other, or for some of you, it'll be on the top of your screen if you're on a phone. You can click in, put your questions there, and that allows us to tee up the questions and tackle the questions as they sort of fit into the flow of today's dialogue. We also encourage commentary in the chat box. Please don't take any hesitation to chime in with your thoughts, commentary on what we're saying or speaking about, whether that's accolades or contrary thoughts. Like, feel free to put them there. If it's really a question, please put it in the Q&A function. And we're otherwise going to keep everyone muted just to sort of help avoid the background dog barking, except occasionally that happens still here at my house. But we'll otherwise keep everyone muted. But if you'd like to explain it or announce it verbally, please note that in your Q&A entry. With that, we look forward to launching into this. But before we get started on today's topic, Richard, we've all come to depend and anticipate heavily your sort of update on stats and market moves. So, and here we are in January, the start of a new year. Very excited to hear how we rounded out last year.
And what can I say? We rounded out last year with record-breaking numbers. The post-COVID surge and recovery continued well into 2021. We've talked about 2020 really being a strong rebound year. Well, we continue to ride that crest, comparing 2021 residential sales to 2019 residential sales. Westchester, just picking a couple of our counties, Westchester was up 19%, Putnam County 10.6%, Rockland 19%, Orange 11%, Dutchess 20%, Suffolk almost 12%. Interestingly, Queens and the Bronx had just an incredible rebound. For Queens, 65.7%, 2021 over 2020, and Bronx 61% from 2021 over 2020. We did see some softening of the market in the fourth quarter, and the 2021 numbers were softer than the 2020 numbers. And I really expected that to happen, quite frankly, because we just couldn't maintain that frenzied pace. And I think what we really saw in the fourth quarter of 2021 was a return to the seasonality of the market that we lost in 2019. I mean, in 2019, we knew that the market totally closed down for all intents and purposes in the second quarter, came roaring back in terms of showings and accepted offers in the third quarter, and that led to a ton of closings in the fourth quarter of 2019. I'm sorry, 2020. So I don't think that we should be thrown off by that softness. And what I focused on when we did our year-end report for the Hudson Gateway Association of Realtors and One Key MLS, is I said, let's not compare 2021 to 2020 fourth quarter. Let's look at 2021 to 2019 and 2018, which were still very strong years. So for example, just in looking at Westchester County, if you compare 2021 to 2020, we were down 15%. But if you compare 2021 to 2019, we were up 20%. So we've got to recognize that some of these comparisons are going to be a little bit dicey for a while, because for all intents and purposes, 2020 and 2021 were exceptional years because of what happened with COVID. So, you know, I think we're going to have little asterisks against some of these numbers for a few years to come, because, you know, a clear comparison is not always going to be the case. But I think these numbers still show incredible resiliency for the New York City and greater suburban market. And I think I'm very bullish as we go into 2022. Do I think we're going to maintain that torrid pace that we had for 2020 and 2021? I don't think so, but I think we're still going to be in a very strong position.
Very well said. And, you know, I think this is something for us to turn to some of our panelists and dive into a little bit, that the nature and the implications of this sort of, you know, sort of the roller coaster, a little bit of the like ups and downs we're seeing, and where should we be comparing them, and what does that mean for our future? You know, Jonathan, as the maven of all things numbers, I'm going to come to you first. You had some interesting commentary on sort of like the seasonality of things and whether or not we're going to see some of that seasonality return here in 2022.
Yeah, well, first, thank you for having me. Richard's point is really, I completely agree with that. You know, anytime we start comparing against, from my perspective, coming out of the city and the relationship between the suburbs, any comparisons this year against 2020, think of 2020 as lacking seasonality for the most part. It was a massive distortion of housing patterns. And really, to get a better sense of where we are, you're absolutely right to look at it 2 years ago. I do that for all the research that we publish around the U.S. It's really a sort of it's a good way to understand where you are right now by looking 2 years ago, which sounds a little odd. One of the things that has been really quite amazing when we think about activity levels. I'm based in Manhattan, so I tend to sort of start there and think about that in the context of everything else. No slight to, I live in Fairfield County, but you know, it's bears mentioning that, you know, I'm sure Joe will touch on this too, like 2020, you know, when you looked at 2021, it felt like, or when we were in 2020, Manhattan felt like there were going to be 9 people left a few months after the lockdown. Literally, like it was just everybody's moving to the suburbs, to the Florida, and the irony of it is that, but it was really a sort of a striking global message. Manhattan was the global hotspot for sure. And Manhattan didn't wake up until 2021. Westchester and counties north of the city just were rocket ships, I described it, in terms of activity, and Manhattan was asleep. Sales activity was way off. For the last 3 quarters of 2020, sales activity was off, depending on the quarter, like 40 to 50%. And so now the narrative has been, just to go super macro on the region, is I think of the city now as the outlier in the sense that they still haven't caught up to what happened in the surrounding counties. And I think we're going to see that in the first half of 2022, heavy volume continuing, bidding wars rising, all that intensity. The problem that the suburbs have that the city doesn't have right now because of the 6 to 9 month lag is that the city has a lot of, it has more to sell. The characteristic of the suburbs, and you could argue for most of the country, is that inventory is not just low, it's insanely low. And even if inventory rises as rates rise a little bit or a lot, whatever it is, I think inventory is going to continue to be low, not fully normalized. So from a pricing standpoint, the outlook for 2022 for me is still above normal volume throughout the region, maybe not the record activity that the different regions saw in moments of 20 and 21. And then pricing also not, we're not looking at a correction. We're looking at potential plateauing or moving sideways as we reach some sort of threshold for affordability as rates start to rise. Anyway, that was the longest answer possible to your question.
but detailed and articulate and nuanced. So the best answer to the question.
Absent of any dad jokes, though, just so you know, I just want to.
Right. That would have gotten you those extra credit points. Definitely.
Okay, I'll try harder.
Oh, Joe, let's see. I had a question teed up, but Joe, you just commented into the chat. Last year on this panel, at this time, I said the sweet spot for getting into Manhattan cheaply had already passed. I was right. By first quarter, they were roaring. Yeah. Joe, I remember that actually. I remember feeling like, oh wait, should I have done something? But you definitely did call that.
Well, I think that the reason was that obviously we had this absolute slowdown, once the lockdown started in April and May, and then and that just shut everybody down in the market of 2020. And then when the market opened up in June, we had this just tidal wave of activity come through the Hudson Valley in northern New Jersey, and I'm sure Long Island as well. That was just all this pent up demand, and then add to the pent up demand of the people that were already ready to move because the market was really strong going into the pandemic lockdown. Then you add all the people that are leaving the city because they don't want density, and they're like, why am I living in the city if I can't go to restaurants and I can't go to museums and everything like that? And what I said at the time was that I thought that what we were really seeing was that a 3-year migratory pattern, like the people that were going to leave the city in either 2020, 2021, or 2022, the people that had just had a kid, were trying to get pregnant, had a young, the kid was sleeping in the closet, all that kind of stuff that you deal with limited space in the city, they were all leaving. So it wasn't as if I don't think it was like people that weren't planning on leaving the city were leaving. I think everybody that had a thought that at some point we're going to leave the city, they're like, well, we might as well leave now. And they just accelerated all of this activity in the suburbs and had this artificial kind of slowdown in the city. And I remember people telling me in the fall and the winter, oh my God, look what's going on in Manhattan. What would be a good time for me if I want to jump in and buy a pied-à-terre or something like that? That's the questions I get. I get the pied-à-terre questions from the suburbs. And I said to them, well, right now, do it right now if you want to do it. Because I think the city, there's nothing inherently wrong with the city. It's that, the lockdown will eventually, the pandemic concerns will eventually ease, and then the city will get back to normal. And to some extent, we saw that in 2021. I think that Jonathan said that we're not really near the level that we were at going into the pandemic. But the fact is that I look at the markets I look at in the Bronx and Hudson County in New Jersey, which are the two urban, or New York City market or a very urban market in Hudson County that I look at in my market. those behave very differently from the other suburban markets. I call them Manhattan adjacent, and they didn't quite have as big a 2020 as the other suburban markets did. So they came roaring back in 2021. Like that's, you mentioned the Bronx, Richard, before. The Bronx had a huge year, much more so than even the other suburbs. And you're right that, you can't really compare against the quarter on quarter because the quarters were so skewed last year by, you say it's a lack of seasonality. I think it was just all this tidal wave of activity in the third and fourth quarters that just overwhelmed everything. But, there is some consistency. I just looked at the numbers, and I had New York, the New York suburban area, Westchester and the Hudson Valley, up 10% in sales for the year. Not looking at quarter on quarter, just sort of letting everything balance out. 10% up for the year, 13% up in prices. And then I look at the northern New Jersey counties that are in our market, and they were also up 10% in sales, and they were up 11% in prices. So there was sort of a uniform. The year had its ups and downs compared to 2020 because of the pandemic skewed when people bought homes back in 2020. But 2021, we had a return of seasonality, and at the end of the year, things were up from last year overall, which is what made 2021 really the strongest year on record for the markets that we cover in the suburbs.
I also think, Joe, to that point, that in 2021, schools went back in session, in person, full time. And so in Manhattan, that created a tremendous amount of demand in Q2 and Q3 as people, whether it was private schools or public schools, if you wanted your child to stay in school in New York, you needed to move back to the city. And so suddenly you were going to be working from home with kids going to school, and you needed something bigger, larger. Your concept of what it meant to live in a New York City apartment and how much space you needed changed dramatically. And I think that created a lot of demand also that fueled certainly Q3 and part of Q2 demand as well in Manhattan.
Yeah, I think well said, Marissa. And I'm going to turn to one of the questions in our Q&A coming in from Jeff Kuchara, a Brooklyn agent. He asks, in regards to pricing, it is anticipated that buyer demand will continue to outpace new inventory despite interest rate increases. Should buyers come to terms that pricing may not come down at all? And Marissa, this jumps a little bit into some of our interest rate conversation that
Right.
jumps a little ahead in our schedule, but I feel like that's a really relevant part of Jeff's question. Can you give us some of the commentary on how you think about and how Citi is thinking about interest rates, both where we're going and how that impacts this pricing question?
Sure, absolutely. So, there have been a lot of numbers that have come out just in the last week around inflation and CPI. So inflation currently is sitting at 7%. And you hear a lot about Fed tightening as a way to deal with the inflation. Citi thinks that there's going to be 3 increases to the Fed funds rate in 2022, another 3 increases in 2023, and 50 basis points of increases in 2024. So 75 basis points this year, 75 basis points next year, 50 basis points the year after, to get us to a Fed funds rate of about 2%. While that's happening, we think there's going to be a tightening in the yield curve. So we see the 10-year going to around 2.1 by year end. It's currently one as high as 1.8. It's was down to 1.75 as of yesterday. I haven't seen it today. So we do think that there's going to be an increase in rates, but we don't see rates going to say 6, 7, 8%. So I think that when clients, and we certainly are talking to clients about this, when they're looking to make purchases on a home, you need to look at basically your overall cost of owning that home. So what is your mortgage cost going to be if you take out a mortgage now and you lock in rates at historically low levels now? Even if they go up another 50%, you're still at historically low rates compared to the last 50 years. And what does that enable you to have as far as purchasing power? And I think that that's a very, you have to look at prices of homes against purchasing power and your ability to service those mortgages and actually hold on to those loans. So I think that that's something brokers should be talking to clients about, not just the cost of a home and the increase in prices, but because rates are still at very low levels, even if the Fed raises by 75 basis points and the 10-year goes up by 30 basis points, you're still at historically low levels. What can you afford to buy that, say, 5 years ago or 10 years ago, you would not have been able to afford?
Yeah.
Brian, if I could just add to
Yeah.
that, I think one of the things that has some potential buyers concerned is, the muscle memory from the financial crisis was the word correction, and I just want to point out, like, that everybody always says this time it's different. So I'll sort of couch that phrase, but say that the way you should think of it is right now that what's characterizing the housing market in terms of why it's unlikely, even if rates trend higher, as Marissa is indicating, inventory still will rise, but will still remain far below sort of parity with demand. Because as Marissa's saying, rates are still extremely low. The other thing I'd point out is that mortgage underwriting standards across the country are far tighter than they were, during the financial crisis, like night and day. So we're not seeing, a legion of home buyers that weren't really qualified for any fluctuation beyond the teaser rate. Like this is a really solid sort of mortgage environment. I think I might have said on the last time we did this that about half of Americans have a mortgage rate of 4% or less. So I think we start not worrying, but thinking about a meaningful slowdown in the elevated activity that we're seeing now as rates start to pass 4%. We're not there yet, and I'm not picking it like some sort of magic number, but the fact that rates are rising or potentially rising, there doesn't seem to be a spike or something really unusual in that. It's what normal markets do when the economy is booming, is rates tend to rise. So that's a good thing. More wage growth and all those sort of things come along with that. So I'm pretty optimistic about the next several years, even with higher rates. I'd love to see rates, a little bit higher. Just we're sort of, addicted to very low numbers. So it's definitely an interesting time, but I think the homeowners' concerns are their muscle memory is based on the financial crisis and not the conditions that exist today.
Yeah.
Jonathan, I think that's a great point. And also, mortgage rates currently are, say, 2 3/4 for a 10-1 ARM, 3% for, a 30-year fixed, at least in the private banking world. There's a lot of room to go before you hit 4%. And none of these moves are going to be happening that quickly, right? They're going to take time. There's not going to be a knee-jerk reaction, whether from the Fed or investors who are looking at, the 10-year, which mortgages often price off of also. So we're not seeing extreme moves. And also on the inflation front, while it's very high now, Citi's view is that a lot of what is driving inflation, kind of like the real estate, is being driven by supply and demand and the supply chain and lack of inventory. And we think that that's going to normalize as people get back to work. Omicron has kind of thrown a wrench in things, but in the next few months, that's going to normalize. People are going to be, factories are not going to be closing on regular basis. And we see inflation coming down to a more normalized level around 3%, certainly by the third quarter to the end of the year.
Yeah. I'm sorry, just a quick, as an aside, I make the observation that, every time there's a new variant, that's a check on rates rising, right? So because it adds uncertainty. So, that increase in rates may be slower than we think, because I don't know if anybody really thinks that there's not going to be another variant, down the road. Hopefully not.
Well, and the first thing I would say about rates is that if anybody comes to me and says, "Oh my God, how can I get a mortgage at 3.5%?" I just gotta give them one of these, because, like, I was so thrilled 20 years ago to get a loan at like 3-year fix for 6.5%, and I felt over the moon about it. People just have to realize it. I think that I agree with all your points about that. I think truly you cannot make a comparison to the last market correction, because the problem there was that there had been such an expansion of credit to people that were otherwise not credit worthy and had these 3-year adjustable rate mortgages or 1-year blow up mortgages, that's what caused all the flood of inventory and the collapse of the system.
Closures.
We don't have that now. I mean, right now, I think that, there's a lot of people who bought homes in the last 5 years who locked in 30 years under 3%. Like, the problem with those people is they may never sell that house because their mortgage deal is too good, that it might not help us with inventory when we get to the point that they should otherwise be selling. But the fact is that, we're still at, like Marissa said, these are historically low from any rational perspective. And if it does go up, that people are like, well, I can't afford it now in a 30-year fixed, they'll just do a 7-year ARM and they'll be fine. Like, 7 years is a long time for someone to live in a house. And most people, they can get that kind of loan, not have a problem. And I agree with you that the other point of it is that, real estate in a time when people think there's some inflation coming, real estate has generally been a good hedge on inflation. So that should help the market overall. I do just as an aside, I do an analysis every year of all the markets that I cover, where I look at the actual monthly payment people have to make to buy a house in my market. And I do it all the way back to like 1981 for Westchester, because I got average sales price data going all the way. So I take the average price for a year, and then I take the average interest rate that was prevailing during that year, according to Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, and I figure out the monthly payment for that year, and then I control for inflation, and then I look at it for like a 40 or 50-year swing. And the fact is, right now, in real dollar terms, the monthly payments to buy a home in the Hudson Valley in northern New Jersey are lower than or as low as they've been anytime, and much lower than the mid 2000s, much lower than the mid 80s, because the rates have been so low. Now, rates, they creep up. That's going to take away a little bit of that. And the fact is, obviously, prices have gone up, but we're still talking from a historical perspective that because of where rates are and because of the effect of inflation over time, you can afford these monthly payments are affordable for the people who are getting them in these areas, so they can still stretch a little bit, and it works out okay. So we still have some room to get to a point where you start saying, wow, prices have gone up, rates have gone up, and now it's stretching to an area that we might have a problem getting buyers into houses.
Brian, can I ask a follow-up question?
Yes, please.
So Joe mentioned some of the numbers that he was looking at for year end, and he was, I think, focusing on single family. I've been focusing on all of residential, so including condo co-op. And it seems to me that 2020 was the year of the single family house. People were looking for more space. They were looking for backyards, and condos and co-ops were pretty flat in 2020. Whereas in 2021, condos and co-ops came roaring back and were a big reason why the 21 year-end numbers were so strong. Am I wrong with that analysis, Jonathan, Joe? Because you're the two numbers.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair depiction, and the reason why I think that happened is because during when the pandemic came upon us and the lockdown and then the release, lower wage earners were far more damaged economically than mid and upper tier salary positions. Mm-hmm. And so if you think of single families, being more expensive than the typical co-op and condo, it makes sense that right out of the gate, it was the single family. And then it kind of fit the narrative, as Marissa was talking about, of, larger space. I'm in a 2-bedroom, 1,200 square foot rental in Manhattan. And I want to get this space and, sort of, away from other people, et cetera. And it just fits in. It makes so much sense. I will point out, in other parts of the country, especially in Florida, I cover about 20 markets there, and the condos where that delay was much shorter. It only lasted like 2 or 3 months after the lockdown ended. It was single family, single family, single family, and then there was parity. But I think in the New York metro area, it was a longer period. Now the condo and co-ops caught up. So now there's not like a standout, at least in my mind, of one versus the other.
We got a question in the one of the questions in the chat, not to take Brian's job away from him of going through the questions, but John Mason asked a question where
it's a mutiny.
How much did the migration in high income city buyers skew the mix of property sold in the suburbs, and did that change some of the pricing, did the price gains represent appreciation in values versus market shifts to different price points? That was his question. The answer would be that I think that what you've just said, Jonathan, about the pandemic hitting harder at the lower income levels, and then people not wanting to buy smaller condos or smaller homes because they wanted more space, and the density, everybody was down on density in 2020. I think it did skew the average sales price a bit last year, that there was just a change in the mix of properties, particularly in the suburbs. Because if you take, for example, just the general people wanting bigger houses, you take the fact that the pandemic hit harder at the lower price points, so those buyers weren't as eager to move. And then you take on top of that this flood of people moving from the city who were paying $4,000 a month for a 1-bedroom rental, who all of a sudden could now afford an $800,000 house. All that stuff, I think, propped up the higher ends of the market throughout the Hudson Valley and Westchester, northern New Jersey. But that eased this year. So there was, I think, a little bit of artificiality, or at least a skew that buoyed the average sales price last year, and it probably impacted a little bit this year. But I think, to answer the question from John, I do think most of the appreciation that we saw in 2021 was legitimate, was like just fundamentals, not that a shift in the types of properties being sold. I think there was a little bit in 2020, but not as much in 2021.
Totally agree. That's very well said. And because that was the story right after the lockdown ended. In many ways, it's oversimplifying, but I described the market inverted, where the high end all of a sudden in suburbia was booming. And that had not been the story since the financial crisis. It was dormant, and that inverted. And we saw the same thing in New York City and the other suburbs in the region. But I think it quickly, I wouldn't say normalized, but it's normalizing, where there's not the standout disparity that there was, where the high end was like where the action was. Now it's much more evenly distributed.
Jonathan, a follow-up to that, and Joe and Marissa, please chime in on this. Well, turning to forward-looking inventory perspective. As we look forward, right, we've seen these sort of waves of like what kind of inventory is available, what's getting snapped up behind us. Now, as you look forward, and maybe you might parse your answer into a little bit of like a New York City, Manhattan kind of part of the answer, and a outside Manhattan, New York City part of the answer. But like, what are you anticipating from an inventory perspective as we look forward? And Jonathan, I may start with you since you're on screen.
Sure. So when so on the topic of inventory, which when we think of the city has more inventory generally, Manhattan specifically, because it was late to the party. So brokers that are selling in Manhattan inventory is a little bit below normal levels, but it's still within 3 to 5% of what I would consider a normal level of inventory, but it's falling rapidly. Whereas that happened 6 to 9 months ago in most of the suburbs, where inventory collapsed because demand just exploded. And so the question is like, well, so how does that play out in the future? So if you forgive me, my sort of homespun description of inventory, if you remove like new construction, which is like 10 or 15% of total supply on average, it could be more or less, but generally, and that's sort of the default ratio for the US. Think of inventory as a living, breathing organism based on life cycles of the owner of the properties. And someone get to a larger space because they have kids on the way, or downsizing because they're an empty nester. All those things take time to sort of organically evolve. And then what we do is we throw, record low mortgage rates at that, on top of a pretty, aside from the early months of the pandemic, actual home buyers were in pretty good economic condition to be able to buy. So think of a 30-year fixed at 5% in 2018. It fell by almost half. Now it's obviously up from half, but that's insane. Like, as far as a driver of demand, I know we want to say, hey, New York is special, and I certainly feel it is, but my goodness, you throw rates like that, that creates insatiable demand, and supply cannot keep up. Even if you built like crazy and doubled output, and it wasn't just skewed luxury, it wouldn't be able to keep up. And so I think the long-term prognosis for inventory, even if rates edge up, is still going to be below long-term norms for the next several years. I don't think this is something that changes in a couple of quarters, even if rates go up somewhat. I think it's nationally, we're like so far beyond what low inventory is in our mind. Like, it is just ridiculous in that context. So my answer is it's going to be tight, and that's why there's not going to be any price correction, because supply is going to remain. And I'm not just saying it in a cavalier, like, I just want to, a lot of people's experiences, the housing bubble, we don't have financial engineering in that context, but we also, the difference between now and then was inventory was rising rapidly during the financial crisis, or before the lead up to the financial crisis. Sales are rising faster. Right. So it felt, and in this case, we don't have that. Right. So I dare to say this time it's different.
Marissa, I want to turn to you. You handle ultra high net worth, some really savvy individuals who've got fantabulous professionals such as yourself and your team helping advise them on their strategic decisions, right? And so they're deploying a lot of capital, they're making decisions, they've got a lot of smart people helping them think about how they make those decisions. As we see some of these things as it relates to interest rate rising things, give us some perspective on what you think the trend is going to be in terms of, like, for that inventory that's out there. Are you still going to see people pursuing it?
Yeah. So what we've seen from flow and what our clients are doing is sort of just like the other areas of the market, we saw tremendous purchases at the high end outside of the city, right, in 2020 into early 2021. And that definitely drove prices and drove inventory. For most clients, it wasn't that they were leaving the city forever. It was just that if they ever thought about buying a second home, now is the time to buy it, because they were going to go live in it and leave New York for the next year or so, especially while they were working from home, their kids were going to school from home, et cetera. And so I think that, when you look at the Hamptons and, high-end neighborhoods, Rye, Westchester, et cetera, you're going to see those prices continue because those people aren't going to sell those homes. They've locked in incredibly low interest rates. They now have their second home that maybe they weren't going to buy for a couple of years. The markets have continued to have incredible returns. So they feel that the money that they've locked in, was a really good buy, and they want financing because they're making more money with their money than they could if they had paid all cash. Now what we're seeing more and more increased demand for larger homes in the city, because even though school went back to work in fall of 2021 and we saw a lot of demand then, we're starting to see that demand come back again, where people are saying, prices in New York are rising, the city is coming back. We had that fall, point where the city opened, the restaurants were open, Broadway was open, and people were doing things again. And it's clear that that's going to come back into focus. Even if it wasn't this month, it will be in another month or two. And we see clients buying. Especially because rates are still so low. And even if it's going to go up 50 basis points, it's still historic lows. And they want to lock in that money now and lock in those investments now and buy bigger now and finance it as much as they can. And that's where we're really seeing demand.
Brian, can I ask a
You're
quick
on, you're on
follow-up?
mute.
I am, but Richard, yes, you can go. And then I'm going to turn to some of our Q&A incoming questions.
Marissa, are you seeing foreign buyers coming back?
So the foreign buyer question is interesting, and it has to do with, we had a tremendous demand for foreign buyers right through the beginning of 2020, even once COVID had started overseas, we still saw foreign buyers in the first quarter of 2020. And then that totally shut down because they couldn't travel. So now that they can travel again, it started with first with foreign buyers not actually coming from Europe, but coming, say, from other Middle Eastern countries, where once they were able to come into the city, they started buying. And now we're seeing that demand from Europeans as well. It's all driven by who can get into the city. And as long as they can fly in, we see interest. The other thing we're seeing with our foreign clients who are also, ultra high net worth clients is they kind of feel still like New York is a little bit on sale. So if they were ever going to buy in New York because they think they'll send their children to college here, because they had a pied-à-terre and now they want something bigger, they're coming back and they're buying, and they're also financing and locking in these very low rates for long terms and seeing huge advantage in doing that. And we're actually seeing, as I think about it now, I have about 6 transactions going on at the moment that are for foreign buyers. We closed an $18 million mortgage for a $36 million purchase in December for a foreign buyer. They're coming back strong.
Great. I'm going to turn to some of our questions here in the Q&A. Ron Garfalo asks, what, if any, will the eviction and foreclosure moratoriums ending have on the market? What is that going to do to, and I think, again, as we sort of think about the different parts of our regional market, there may be different your answer may be parsed out a little bit differently. Joe, I'm curious if you've got any thoughts and perspective of sort of as that ends and we sort of see some of that inventory move into that part of the process, will that change things? Will that unlock any stalled inventory of a meaningful impact?
I mean, you can't compare the release of the foreclosure moratoriums to what we saw in, people think foreclosures and they think 2008, 2009, completely different situation. Yeah. If we get a lifting of the foreclosure moratoriums and that puts more listings on the market will absorb it without even, it'll be like throwing a cup of water into the sea, like nothing. They'll just swallow it up. So that won't be an issue. I think that, I actually don't know how much we'll see, but I can't imagine that there would be any significant increase in foreclosure listings hitting the market that would do anything to. They would be swallowed up. Yeah, it wouldn't change. It wouldn't impact the market in any meaningful way, I don't think. Jonathan
or Marissa, any contrary thoughts? Any debate, or we feel like the cup of water in the ocean is sort of where we're at?
I love that analogy, cup of water in the ocean. I'm going to use that for sure. I'm not going to credit Joe, but
it's actually a crappy analogy. It should actually be a cup of sand in the ocean, right? Like the point is something new. It's water in the ocean is not the same thing. It's new listings coming.
I'll use that one. I'll use that one too. Then
sand is better. Sand is better.
You still won't get any royalties though.
No, I agree. Like that, I don't think it's going to add, if you talk about what is the impact to housing, not what the impact is to the human beings that are being foreclosed, I see it as a nominal, if any, impact. It is something, it's connected, but not, there's not going to be a knee-jerk reaction to the overall market. I think that would be a fair way to care.
It also, there'll be so much time in between because we don't know when the moratorium is going to lift, but even when it lifts, those banks take months, if not years, to turn that inventory around. Like they're not going to hit any time soon.
Agreed.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Okay, another question coming in from Richard Klein. Why do you think the downtown New York City market remains so strong when the office buildings are remaining largely empty and retail is greatly suffering? And then I think this is going to tee us up very nicely for some of our conversation around offices, return to work, some of what we or what you all are thinking for 2022. So who wants to give a shot at some of the thoughts for Richard?
I'm happy to start. I can't use Joe's cup of sand analogy in this though, so I'm going to start without anything. So office towers in Manhattan are about 2/3 empty, 1/3 full. And so that has obvious ramifications for retail. Retail needs that oxygen to exist. And every time we get a new variant, the Fortune 500 companies kick the can down the road in terms of when they're pulling people back. So I look at this as a work in progress. So there's a couple of things when I think about the way people are describing. Right now, you're hearing these sort of, press releases about, that leasing activity is kicking in. It's rising and almost normal in some of the things I've read. But what is missing from that discussion and how those spaces get filled is that office, leasing rates are down sharply. I have firsthand experience, and that's what ultimately happens. I think part of this thing is, hey, let's create more affordable housing in the city by converting all this unused office space to residential. And first of all, that's wildly complicated because they have debt on those buildings. Number two is that you're going to have to get a zoning variance, which is also problematic. And third is that you're going to have to comply with building code versus office code, which is also very expensive. I think what's going to ultimately happen with all that vacant space, just like we saw with the empty, the gutting of the residential rental market in the, after the lockdown ended, rents fell in Manhattan 20-25%. And that primed the pump and got things going. I think there's going to be some of that. Maybe new projects coming in are going to rethink whether they're going to be commercial, but I think we're going to be ending up with a sort of upper tier class A, where the really high rents, they're going to find marquee clients that are going to pay that. And then there's everybody else. And I think that's going to play out over the next 2 or 3 years. But remote is never going away, or at least not in our lifetime. And we haven't begun to sort of figure out the long-term impact of this on office. I know that we're sort of on the extreme end of remote right now because of Omicron, but we're not going back to where we were. And in order to do that, you're going to see a sharp drop in lease rates, which are going to bring in like an eclectic mix of companies that were priced out. And I think that's ultimately not a bad thing for the city.
Yeah. Marissa, you had some interesting commentary on this, especially as it turns, into like, how are companies thinking about this? Your clients, many of the top executives in New York City. How are they thinking about this?
So it's interesting. So I agree with Jonathan that, that remote is not going to go away, but you hear more and more senior executives and owners of companies, and even, large corporates talking about the importance of culture, the importance of team building, the importance of mentorship, the importance of raising your people up and creating a team and creating working environments. And so people want, employers are thinking about getting their employees back to work. So lots of the banks and financial institutions, private equity firms were talking about, 2 days a week in person, or 3 days a week in person this fall. And you felt it, right, in the city as people were back. Clearly that's all changed now in January, but I don't think that change is going to be long. I mean, you're hearing about people talking about spring and how are they going to get people back to work. I think that the way that affects the market, especially in New York, is even if you're only in the office 2-3 days a week, For the junior people, you're no longer living home with your parents, in Aspen or Colorado or Florida or somewhere else. If you've got to be in the office 2 days a week, you've got to be living within commuting distance of your office. So there's going to be demand even at the lower end in Manhattan for people who need to be back in the office. I think what you see also at the higher end, which we talked about, is again the same thing. If you're going to be in the office 2 to 3 days a week, or you're requiring your team to be back, you also need to be there. And then you're not commuting every day from your house in the Hamptons again, or your ski house in Utah, and for the days you are working from home, if your kids are in school, you're looking for more space. So I think that that's really going to drive this market. And I think a lot of it, again, is, the culture of everybody working from home 5 days a week doesn't create culture. And people are looking for that, right? And want to work in that environment. So I think that's really going. Go ahead, Jonathan.
I was just going to add to that. I totally agree. And I think what this morphs into and what you're really describing is a hybrid situation, right? So, I like to look at it as you have remote workers, which are, 100% remote, which is a very small number. It's the next half of the workforce that's going to be working 4-3-2 or 1 day in the office a week. And we don't know what that is yet. We have the highest quit rate on record, because if people don't want to come in as 4 days a week or whatever it is, they quit and go to a company. So it becomes like a job benefit. I just had a good friend of mine, a Wall Street analyst, just hired a sort of Fortune 500 caliber employee that he couldn't afford otherwise, but they want to live in Florida. Mm-hmm. And so they get the benefit of that knowledge base at lower compensation because they can do their job remote. The problem is, and we're finding in our company, we've been hiring this year, and you can't mentor or train new employees over Zoom. It's impossible. So there has to be a hybrid solution. And what I'm suggesting right now, we're at the extreme end of working at home, but we're not going back to anywhere close to where we were when we started.
If I could chime in. Oh,
sorry. I was just going to say, I totally agree with Jonathan on that. And so it's that hybrid concept is going to be with us for a long time. But I think the concept of everybody remote all the time is not going to continue. So that will increase demand for residential closer to work, but also it's going to change the office environment. You don't need a desk for someone 5 days a week if they're only in the office 3 days a week. And then you have these discussions around hoteling and how people are going to revamp their office space and maybe need less office space as they create these kind of shared desk concepts. And so what an office is going to look like inside is going to, especially at the corporate level, is going to feel very different than maybe it did 5 years ago. And that's still changing and growing and morphing into what the new normal is going to look like.
A question for you all on this, and I sort of, I may make this our sort of like rounding out question, because I think it's an important one for what we see in 2022 and on the heels of this office space. So, right, in 2020, people went full remote, right? 2021, we got to a point where by summer of 2021, before we heard about Delta, Omicron, it was like sort of like the future was looking like, oh, wait, and a lot of companies were like, come September 1st, come October 1st, 100% back in office, right? Like there were these like big declaratory statements by some companies and like everyone's coming back in. Then we get Delta, then we get now sort of Omicron. And it feels like more than ever, and Marissa, I think this lines up with what you're saying, and Jonathan, you as well, that what we're going to see is this 4-3. There may be some people that are that, high talent person in Florida that you can hire that's going to be 5 days remote. By and large, we're going to see a lot of these 4-3-2-1s, right? Like some level of this, and the market's going to shake out, and that's where we're going to see a lot of that. Now, as we look forward in 2022, we've now gotten more aware of how this pandemic is had its waves, and how that might be that we're not 100% going back in the office on September 1st, right? So companies have sort of like gotten a little bit more familiar with this, the vaccine efficacy and all that kind of stuff. So now as we look forward in 2022, and we assume that state of affairs, that companies are attempting to modulate their workplaces and their in-office requirements to deal with and accommodate a 4-3-2-1 kind of thing. What are your thoughts on what that does for New York City real estate in terms of like demand, Manhattan, New York City, surrounding areas, right? And this will sort of maybe be our, as we're at the top of the hour almost, our final question. And if you have any other thoughts on another topic you want to chime in, we've had a phenomenal conversation today and stuff. So what do you think that's going to do as it relates to sort of demand in these respective markets?
Well, I could just chime in, start from the city's perspective, is, the rental market, we just published today, it's the first time that rents in aggregate for Manhattan reached equated to pre-pandemic levels. The market is extremely polarized. So the upper half of the market is 7.7% above 2 year ago levels, and the bottom half of the market is 6.6% below. So there's more polarization than ever. But I see this sort of coming back to the office as another upside for rental demand, because now all those central business districts are going to enjoy greater tenancy. Because, ultimately, if I have to come in a couple days a week, and versus 5 days a week at home, maybe I'll live closer to the office. And I think that's something that we'll see. I also think that what you're suggesting is too fast. I think this is going to be 2, 3, 4 years out. This is a process. It's not going to be like a light switch. The things we're saying now, so many things could happen. We don't know. I mean, last September it was pretty obvious, from everything you read, that the world was going to restart in September, because all the Fortune 500 companies, 100% coming back. You had the Wall Street firms like Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley and JP Morgan all saying, if you're not coming back to the office, then you need to look at another profession, because we want you here. And now all of a sudden that's not kind of working. So anyway, that's my.
I think to Jonathan's point, I think for the financial services companies, especially, the concept is still that people will be in the office, and I don't think it's a 1 day a week. I think it's, 3 days a week may be the new normal. Some people may be able to get 2, some people it may be 4. But I think that at the sort of studio 1 bedroom purchase price and the rental market, you're going to see increased demand there, because the younger people, right, the 30s and under, who now need to be in the office, are going to need a place to live. And for those 2 days a week when they are working from home, they want a nice place to live. Suddenly, and they're willing to spend more money on that, because suddenly working out of your bedroom with 3 roommates when you're working from home 2 days a week, and this may now be your new normal, and you want that and you're demanding that for your quality of life, also means that you need a larger bedroom or an extra space to work out of. So I think it's really good, and you're going to see that. I'm certainly hearing that from colleagues and within our office structure that's very much coming back. So I think that's good for the city. And I also think that when you're in the office, the nice thing also about the city is that you'll see, like you did this fall, a resurgence, because when people are back in the office, then they're in restaurants and they're buying things, and they're in the Duane Reade and the CVS, and you see them on the bus and the subway, and that breeds more interest in more people coming back to the city as well.
Excellent. Joe, what do you think?
I think we all overstate all of us, the whole industry and the whole culture overstates the joy of working from home. Like, working from home is not great, like I work from home. If I want to go have lunch, I got to get in my car. I got to go drive somewhere. I used to work in the city. I lived 17 years in Manhattan. I wanted to go to lunch. There were 500 amazing restaurants that I could walk to from wherever my office happened to be. I think the question was, will demand for residential real estate in the city lapse because people are working from home? If they're working from the suburbs and they get to work from home 1 or 2 days a week, they still need a place. They don't want to commute 3-4 days a week into the city. They might get a second place. I just think that, particularly as Marissa said, the younger cohort, first of all, their bosses are going to make them work in the office because they want to see them around for the mentoring aspect. Then they don't have the power to be able to say, like the way that Jonathan Superstar does, who wants to live in Florida. They're going to have to work in the office, and probably they do. What I've learned over all these years of living in the city and then moving to the suburbs and then seeing people move to the suburbs is they move to the suburbs when they have kids. That's when they move to the suburbs. Nobody who's 25 says, I can't wait to move out to Carmel. I can't wait to move out to Yorktown or, Millwood or wherever the hell else I can't wait to do that so I can live in a big 3-bedroom house or 4-bedroom colonial with a picket fence by myself. Nobody does that. So they're going to keep living in the city. And if they work from home, they're going to work from their 1 bedroom on the Upper West Side. That's what's going to happen. It's going to be fine. People want to live in the city.
That was
awesome.
Absolutely brilliant. Like, you are so
right.
You heard it here first, people.
People love living in the city. It's awesome.
What
Yeah.
was the tagline the other day, Joe? You can't get good Thai elsewhere.
right.
You can't get good. Yeah. The one thing I've learned is when I go to the city, I get Thai food because I just not to besmirch the fine Thai restaurants in the Hudson Valley, but
Right.
there's a slight difference.
Yeah, I hear you. Well, look, we're a little bit over time, but thank you, Jonathan, Joe, Marissa. Thank you so much for being here. It's been a great conversation, very engaged, lots of back and forth. Clearly, we could keep talking. I've got a lot of other questions to ask you. We're going to have you back. I'm confident we're going to talk more about this in 2022. We recorded the session. So, Joe, just like your Q1 2020 or Q1 2021 prognostication, we look forward to revisiting some of these in the future and seeing how we did. Thank you again to Richard and the whole HGAR team for hosting this. And thank you all for attending. Here's to a great 2022 together. Hopefully this advice and information has helped set you all up for a little success, a little orientation towards how you're going to help advise your home buyers and sellers. Take care, everybody. Have a great day.
Very much.
Yeah, thank you
so
for
much.
having
Great
us.
job.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
And Jonathan, we held on to almost everybody, just FYI.
Absolutely.